Hello. Yes, going on always catches me by surprise. This, of course, is being sent out to my AP European class. Hi, guys. I know that this is you're in between periods now, but I'm going to save this. I have to say I'm actually not in a great mood this morning because I worked diligently creating a 30-minute lecture for my arts and humanities class, and then I went back to add some changes, descriptions, and I may have just not saved and then X'd out of it, and suddenly, voila, it's gone, and I can't find it again. And so, yeah, that makes me unhappy, but as with all things, live and learn, I suppose. So what do we talk about today before we talk about World War One? Well, I have to say that this coronavirus, bad news, good news. The bad news, the coronavirus, is that you may have heard there is a woman from Kenton County, our adjoining county, who has tested positive for the virus. That means that it is very real. It's very here. And good news is that in Wuhan, China, where this virus originated, there were no new cases reported. And so, yeah, that's great news. And so, yeah, going forward, let's just have to hope on that. Let's hope that we can use China's experience to make our experience, easier to get by on. And so, yeah. I hope you all enjoyed the pictures I sent last night. I did put your grades, the ones that I had, in Infinite Campus, which is most of them. And most of the results were very, very good. I cannot promise you that you'll be getting another test like that. I do promise you that I'm going to find another way to assess you besides just test, something you can do at home and receive a decent grade for. This change in the way this course is run is the fault of none of us. And so, we need to get through. Like I said in my Arts and Humanities video, which I think I deleted. Can you believe that? I would like to be channeling my inner Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill was probably the greatest orator, speaker of the English language than anyone, and I would like to channel him right now. And to be honest, don't go, oh, Mr. Horton's a Winston Churchill fan. He was a great individual, but to be real honest, he was also an imperialist, meaning that he believed in the British Empire. He was not exactly a fan, for example, of the Mahatma Gandhi. He called him a half-naked fakir, which is really not a nice thing to say. We'll talk about Gandhi later on. Believe it or not, in European history, Gandhi, the great Indian, is included. But yes, for now, let's talk about World War One. I do hope that you looked at the pictures I sent you. And like I said in an email, I really was looking forward to teaching the 20th century. I had so many resources that I personally collected, such as that trip to that museum in Budapest, as well as traveling around Poland, going to Auschwitz, things of that nature. So I guess I'll just have to do those online. So let's do a quick check. What do we need? Of course, handy dandy textbook, page 712. Yeah, 713. That's where we are. Yes. And beginning in the new chapter, 718. Yes, better, 718. That's a good place to turn. Of course, Mr. World According to Horton Study Guide, always handy. Of course, Mr. Navy Pen. And yes, I'll be using these this morning, although the horrible bee stinging in my nose that I experienced at the beginning of the week, and I don't mean I got stung by a bee. I mean, the allergies actually felt like there was a bee up there just going to town. And this, my wife now makes me change clothes and take a bath when I go home. Yeah, but I guess she's right. Oh, yes. Can't go anywhere without this. But yes. If somebody's imaginative out there in my AP Euro class, and I think there will be, what you should do for some kicks, you should make a highlight reel of me when these stupid lights go off, as they do. And it just makes me crazy. But anyway, let's talk, shall we? So the war has started. Through Roman numeral 15, if you want to catch up. Throughout Europe, jubilation greeted the news of war. I mean, today, that for us, we think, how in the world can that happen? When I say jubilation, I mean that when war was declared, people ran out in the streets, and there was fireworks going off, there were parties being held. Everybody wanted to sign up for this and go off. In fact, many people were afraid the war would be over before they got there. The old saying is about World War I and World War II. In World War I, since all the leaders of Europe, all the crown heads, were literally related, cousins, they were all crying, but the people were all joyous. World War II, it is said, it's just the opposite. The people who had already experienced a war 20 years earlier, this is 1939, people who had already experienced a war were just woefully crying this coming. And then you have your leaders who, Adolf Hitler, Mussolini, people who saw opportunity in the war, that were very excited about the prospects. So there was jubilation, as war had not shown its ugly head in Europe since 1815. Now you're saying, wait a minute, Mr. Horton, what about Crimean War? What about Franco-Prussian War? What about the Boer War? Those are pretty much minor dust-ups. I mean, really. The Crimean War, once again, was off in the Crimea and maybe in the Baltic to a lesser degree. It was far and away from most of the people of Europe who only read about it. The Franco-Prussian War was over in 6 months. Only included France and the new government of Germany. 7 weeks war. They were very short, brief, and like that. The Boer War and the other wars that England got into, they were in foreign lands. But this war was going to end the century of peace. And so, this was different. Both sides expected to win and win quickly. Why? I mean, once again, and I talked about this yesterday, people just forget what war is like over time. They just forget what it's like. And so both sides expected to take the offensive and win. The von Schlieffen Plan involved Germany once again going around French defenses, going around the they didn't have the March, going around the Rhine River and slipping in through Belgium. to the English Channel, and then wheeling southward and crushing. Stupid. Yeah. Crushing the French against the German fortresses in Lorraine. In the Russian front, the Germans planned to just hold on. I mean, that was the von Schlieffen Plan. The Germans just planned to guard their border, make sure the Russians weren't doing anything, because the expectation was that Russia would not be ready. And the Germans figured that the defeat of France would be done in 6 weeks. I mean, they'd done it in 6 months, but they had better weapons now. So, the attack on France had to be strong enough to drive the French back and to keep the British out of the war. Now, the French also believed in their offensive firepower, but they actually, the French had less reason to believe than the Germans. The French, had badly underestimated the numbers and effectiveness of the Germans. France had a larger population than Germany, and had badly overestimated the courage and the spirit of their own soldiers. The French called it état. État means the idea that, okay, French soldiers are fighting together, and the person, your buddy on the right, is wounded, incapacitated. Well, his fighting spirit would then come into you and push you forward. It's a nice idea until you actually see that buddy get his head blown off, or you see one of your friends get trench foot, which if you want to, you should look up trench foot, TRENCHFOOT, trench foot. Don't eat your lunch first. You won't want to eat it afterwards. It's nasty. But yeah, those kind of things. The French were unrealistic. The British and the French offensive at first were thrown back, but that also freed up soldiers to stop the German advance in the Marne in September of 1914. The casualties and bombardments and troop numbers of this war stifled anything that they had ever seen before. The machine gun brought about casualties in unheard of numbers, because unfortunately, and I told you this before, the technology of warfare has always been more rapid, more advanced than the tactics used, oftentimes. And the ones who suffer then are the poor soldiers. For example, in the American Civil War, you have these armies of 30, 40, 60,000 marching across a field, shoulder to shoulder, against another army, 30, 40, 50,000, shoulder to shoulder, marching against them, and then letting fire with not muskets anymore, but rifles. And to this very day, the American Civil War has more casualties than all the other wars combined, including World War I and II. So let's get back to the subject. So the machine gun, now you're talking about soldiers charging across open fields with a machine gun could spray 400 rounds a minute. 400 rounds a minute. And so, running across an open field into that is suicide. And yet they did it. Poison gas, one of the new weapons, was terrifying, but ineffective. No, don't be mistaken. It killed and maimed lots and lots of soldiers, but it was ineffective, undependable. You had to depend upon the wind. The tank arrived in 1916 to answer the machine gun, but it came very late in the war and had all kind of problems. Defense will be supreme on the Western Front. Often yards would be paid for literally in thousands of lives. I mean, after the Germans dig in, the British and French are forced to dig in, and we're talking about a series of trenches that you can still see remnants of in France and Belgium today, of old pillboxes, things of that nature. But there was a line of trenches that stretched from the Alps in the south all the way up along the border between France and Germany, crosses into Belgium, and all the way to the North Sea. And those lines remained stationary pretty much for 3 years. There wasn't a whole lot of movement. It became World War I will quickly become, and you need to know this term, a war of attrition. ATRITION. Attrition. ATRITION. What does that mean? A war of attrition is a war to simply see who can last the longest, who can sustain damage the longest without quitting. And there was going to be a lot of damage in this war. This war also will be one of the first wars where civilians, if not the first war, where more civilians die in World War I than soldiers. And that is by design. Each side wanted to kill the other civilian population as a way of making the war costly, as a way of convincing the other side that they need to surrender. And so, yeah. All right. In the east, on the Eastern Front between Russia, Germany, and Austria, Russians advanced into Austrian territory and inflicted heavy casualties at first. The German generals Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff, though, captured an entire army at Tannenberg Lakes and then defeated another one at the Marusian Lakes. In 1915, the Central Powers inflicted more than 2 million casualties on the Russians in just 1 year. 2 million casualties. That is exactly what the Russian Tsar did not need to happen. 2 million. Stupid. I hate this. Come on. I'm about to get up. $2 million casualties on Russian. So, you like how I just went right back into that? 2 million casualties on the Russian army. That's exactly the kind of press that Tsar Nicholas II did not need. You know, he had gotten in this war basically to save face because the Serbians asked him to, and now the Russians in 1915 were having their heads handed to them. So, where are we at here? Yes. The Ottoman Empire then joined the Central Powers because of their hatred for Russia. Italy wanted Austrian territory. And remember, Italy was one of the original Triple Alliance: Germany, Austria, and Italy. But Italy wanted Austrian territory, so they changed sides in 1916 and formed what was called Italia Irredenta, because they wanted the southern part of Tyrol, which is, if you go to Italy today, in the northern part of Italy, the northeastern part of Italy, you'll notice the culture and a lot of the language is very, very German. And that's because, yeah, it was once part of Austria. Trieste, which is a city on the Adriatic, and some of the Dalmatian islands, plus African possessions. The Italians joined, so the Italians switched side, left the Triple Alliance, became part of the Triple Entente. There was some help, but really not much. Romania joined the Allies in 1916. Japan honored its alliance with Great Britain and entered the war and took German positions in China and the Pacific and used this opportunity. Yeah, the Japanese jumped into World War I. Because they saw it as opportunity. They saw it as an opportunity to expand Japanese land holdings in not only China, but also German island holdings in the Pacific. And Japan believes that at the end of the war, they'll get to keep all that. No. And this will hack the Japanese off to a great degree. And I mean, to be real honest, the Japanese were being discriminated against because they were not white. Yes. At the end of the war, we'll talk about that later on. But you know, the Japanese they jumped in the war and they attacked Germany in the Far East, which of course they were very successful. The Far East was not really one of Germany's primary concerns in World War I. Both sides, in an effort to attract allies and to weaken their enemies, appealed to nationalistic feelings in other regions of the world. You say, what does that mean? Remember that most of the countries involved now are colonial, are colonial countries. They own colonies scattered around the world. And so each side tried to appeal to the colonies of their enemy to rise up and fight against their colonial masters so as to detract from the British or the French or the Germans or the Ottomans' ability to wage war. Yes. For example, the Germans supported nationalist groups in Ireland. They supported the Flemish in Belgium and the Poles and Ukrainians under Russian rule. They even encouraged the Turks to get Muslim revolts going in Egypt and India against the British and against the French in North Africa. The Allies did the same with the Czechs, the Slovaks, the Southern Slavs, and the Poles who were under Austrian rule. They also pushed for Arab independence through a guy named T.E. Lawrence. Now you're saying, who is T.E. Lawrence? T.E. Lawrence is the famous Lawrence of Arabia. He was a British officer who the British gave the mission of going into the Ottoman Empire, going to the Middle East, and getting the Arab Bedouin tribes of what is now Saudi Arabia to unite and fight against the Turks. And you may have heard the name Lawrence of Arabia before. It is a movie that won just about every Academy Award in the early 60s, starred Peter O'Toole. Before you jump to watch it, I have to warn you, it's really, really, really long and kind of waning on the excitement. Although it's a cinematic masterpiece. I mean, because they filmed this in Saudi Arabia with temperature, and in Egypt, and with temperatures, going over 100 degrees every day. It must have been just brutal. But yeah. Lawrence of Arabia. If you really get bored by quarantine, I'm sure the Turner Network has it every once in a while. But yeah, Lawrence of Arabia. So Winston Churchill, as at this point in time in World War I, Winston Churchill was Lord of the Admiralty, and he encouraged a plan to attack Constantinople and to put the Ottoman Empire out of the war. The plan called for speed and leadership, and those things were lacking. The plan was called Gallipoli. And if you look at your book, this is making me crazy. Yes, page 730, there's a map in your book that actually shows you where Gallipoli is. It's a peninsula into the Bosporus and the Dardanelles that was attacked mainly by British and, not British, actually Australian and Canadian soldiers. And it was, how do we say this, a disaster. Yes, lots and lots and lots of dead Australian and Canadian soldiers. But anyway, but it diverted more than 3 times that number from other uses. So, in 1916, the Germans, under General Erich von Falkenhayn, tried to attack the French fortress at Verdun. Verdun is located, I think, more towards the middle of France. but Verdun will be critical, because in Verdun, the Germans will try to assault this French fortress. The battle will literally last for a year, and both the Germans and the French will inflict both the Germans and the French will inflict 1 million casualties on each other. So yeah, the commander of the French fortress at Verdun was a guy named Henri Pétain. His name is actually kind of worth remembering, Henri, P-E-T-A-I-N. Pétain, his motto was, "They shall not pass," which I always thought was funny. Not only did they use it in Lord of the Rings, but I always wanted to use it for AP Euro, but that'd be mean. But anyway, "They shall not pass" became a national slogan. But the long and short of it was, you're talking about 1 million casualties. 1 million casualties in one battle on each side. I mean, the World War I, it really was just a meat grinder. That will be dwarfed by World War II. But for that point in time, the number of people, the number of soldiers who was dying, was just off the charts. So the Allies then tried to launch a major offensive of their own at the Battle of the Somme, which is in Belgium. But once again, defense wins. The British Army lost 20,000 men in an afternoon. I mean, you just throw these numbers around, and if you really think about those numbers, 20,000 men in an afternoon, wiped out, in one battle. It's just horrific. But anyway, the Allies lost many men, but made little gain. The war at the sea became more and more important, because more and more materials had to be shipped over. And so, yeah, the war at the sea, and oh yes, of course, submarine warfare. So the British seized any and all shipments going to Germany, whether they were war contraband or not. Now we're going to get into this thing called unrestricted submarine warfare. And it's really a interesting phenomenon. So Germany knew going into World War I that they did not have the Navy that could stand toe-to-toe with Great Britain. And so they decided, we're going to do something else. And so how do you attack the best Navy in the world? Well, you look at that country's weakness. What was Britain's weakness? Let's go back to the repeal of the Corn Laws of 1848. The British repealed the Corn Laws, and that meant going forward that Britain was going to have to depend upon foodstuffs that were shipped into Britain. And so the Germans said, what if that got cut off? And so what the Germans did, they began developing large numbers of tiny, and they were small. The U-boats were really small in World War I. Small, clumsy, not seaworthy. Here's a stat for you. In World War I, German sailors serving on U-boats, 1 out of 6 survived. I mean, yeah, U-boats were very deadly, but at the same time, if you were on a U-boat, your life, the odds were stacked against you. But anyway, so the British fed themselves by shipping, and the Germans planned to stop that. And so the Germans at first were nice about it. At first, the Germans simply would find a ship that was making its way to Britain that would have provisions or whatever, and the U-boat would surface, fire a shot across that ship's bow. All the early German submarines had deck guns. Surface, fire a shot across that submarine's bow, or either that transport ship's bow, and then say, you need to follow us into a friendly port. Now, well, very quickly, merchant ships got pretty wise to this. And so when the Germans would do this, many merchant ships began arming themselves. Because, see, the great weakness of submarines was that they were not really seaworthy. Any sort of damage in a submarine could be deadly to that submarine because, remember, you go underwater, the pressure of the water increases. Any kind of structural damage could really be detrimental to a submarine. And so what the Germans had to do to save their submarines, they had to resort to something called unrestricted submarine warfare. You say, what does that mean? It means that these same German submarines, instead of surfacing, firing shot off the bow, and saying, hey, come with us, instead, these submarines would simply attack. They would see merchant ships, slam a torpedo into the side, one or two, and that ship would go down. And that meant that all those foodstuffs, all that material, and yes, even soldiers would go down with the ship. And so, German submarines, I mean, there is, I have a map that I'll have to send you tonight that I took in one of my trips. It showed Great Britain and Ireland, and it showed little red dots in every place there was a sinking by a German submarine in World War I. And it looks like, Swiss cheese, just full of red dots all over the place, particularly off the coast of Ireland, particularly in the Irish Sea. Basically the area surrounding Britain and Ireland became a German lake of submarines. It's very dangerous. And so, that did have an effect on the British. But what most people do not pay much attention to is the fact that while the Germans were doing that to the British were choking the life out of the Germans, literally, because the British Navy, I want to get up a minute. The British Navy blockaded, the British Navy blockaded the North Sea and any entrance into Germany, and very quickly began to take a toll on the livelihood of the German populace. Food shortages quickly occurred. In fact, one of the things I will have to send you is a picture, I'll put it on canvas, is a picture that shows people in Munich in 1917 stripping a dead horse for its meat. The horse had dropped dead on the streets of Munich, and you have a bunch of people standing around that horse waiting their turn to, take a slice home for the family. You'll excuse me a minute. There's just no way. Anyway, yes. Now, however, the Germans responded with submarine warfare, whose intent was to starve Britain that depended so heavily on goods shipped in from across the oceans. The sinkings of the German subs, though, were much more unpopular than the British blockade and the seizure of cargo. I mean, the British, all they had to do was, they had the world's largest surface navy. They would stop the ship and then seize all the cargo, but the people, they walked away from it. The Germans had to sink the ships, and they sank them without warning. And so the Germans, but you got to, once again, defend the Germans. I used to, in my World Civ class, would make the students defend the German use of unrestricted submarine warfare in World War I. And one of the defenses of that was, the Germans tried to persuade people in the United States and Canada the Germans put up signs at every American port, New Orleans, New York, didn't matter. And next to a ship that would be crossing the ocean to go to England, and basically the sign would say, this ship is going into a war zone. If you get on this ship, you are endangering your life. Don't do it. And it didn't matter. And so, but now, I always say, think of it this way. So the Germans are using unrestricted submarine warfare. They're taking innocent lives. The British are just, stopping shipment of foodstuffs going into Germany. But in reality, imagine that you are in a fight with, say, me, and I'm really just beating the crap out of you. And so, and as the fight continues to go on, it becomes more and more apparent that I'm going to win and you're not going to live. And then, as the fight goes on, you think, wait a minute. I have a .357 Magnum in my pocket. But if I use that on Mr. Horton, that would be cheating and unfair. So should I use it on Mr. Horton? Because if I don't use it on Mr. Horton, then I'm going to die. Because he's going to kill me. So the question is, do you use it? And the answer the Germans came up with was, yeah. All's fair in love and war. Anyway, back to the matter at hand. Where was I at? On May of 1915, the Germans torpedoed and sank the HMS Lusitania, and there were 1,200 deaths, and amongst those were 118 Americans who died on the Lusitania. Now, interesting thing about the Lusitania is this. The Lusitania was, in fact, it was sank literally within sight of the coast of Ireland. I mean, they could see the ship when it sank. But, swimming from that ship to the coast of Ireland was not going to happen because the water is kind of cold. But anyway, so the ship, though, the Lusitania sank in 11 minutes. By comparison, now I know a lot of you guys out there have watched Titanic. How long did it take Titanic to sink? It took nearly 2 hours. Yeah, in real time, it took nearly 2 hours. I know the film makes it shorter, but it took nearly 2 hours for that ship to go under, which is still a lot of time. I mean, a lot of people died in that sinking, but 11 minutes, yeah, people didn't have a chance. There has been conjecture that ship was carrying war materials, which would have been a violation of the Geneva, one of the treaties they had. You're not supposed to put civilians on the same ship with explosives. And there was on that ship. There had to have been. I mean, the explosion ripped out the bottom of the ship. And so, yeah. So whose fault is that? Is that the Germans for sinking the ship in an act of war, or is that the British for stocking a merchant ship, a passenger ship, with explosives? Well, it didn't matter because everybody blamed the Germans. And so, because of that, American President Woodrow Wilson, first time we've mentioned him, warned the Germans that more such acts would result in dire consequences. Wilson did not want to get into this war. In fact, Wilson campaigned in 1916. When he ran for re-election, his motto was, "He kept us out of war," in 1916. That's going to change. The Germans then desisted, and this delay brought a great advantage to the Allies. The only major activity after this was that the Germans played a part in was the Battle of Jutland, Jutland. The battle was a standoff, and the bottom line of it was every ship that the British sank on the side of the Germans could not be replaced. Every ship that were sank by the British could be. End of story. The battle was standoff, but reaffirmed British dominance of the sea. Okay, I'm going nearly over time, so let me do one more thing. Roman numeral 17. In May of 1916, Woodrow Wilson of the United States tried to get the warring powers to sit down and talk, and none of them would have anything to do with it. Two events early in 1917 changed the United States' stance in the war. On February 1st, the Germans resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. You say, well, why did they do that? They were losing. Once again, go back to the me fighting Horton analogy. Mr. Horton is killing me. It's time to pull out the 357 Magnum. And March of 1917, the Russian Revolution will put an end to Russian involvement in the war. The Tsar will step down. Russia is going to basically pull out of the war in 1917. Okay, we'll talk about the Russian Revolution tomorrow. And I promise you, I am not going to delete this YouTube video. So I'll put it up. And I can't believe I did it to my other class. I just feel terrible about that. But I guess I'll be redoing that today. Thank you all. I'm not going to start. Thank you all. It's wonderful to see you. And keep washing those hands. I'll talk to you tomorrow.